bring it back to shipwrecks, I would like to ask you, so are there any for you pretty significant, two-parter, are there any significant ones for you that you guys have found? Because I know we touched on the Tuskegee. That was a big one that you and I talked about on the phone. For shipwrecks, are there any big notable ones that we would know about, or at least for you that were significant? And then I'll do a follow-up question after that.
Yeah, that's a good question. There are extremely unique shipwrecks out there. Boats like Griffin, boats like the German World War I submarine in Lake Michigan, things like that. The French minesweepers, that a lot of people are really attracted to because of their uniqueness. But I think I find myself um, really getting immersed, no pun intended, on the vessels that I'm researching at any particular time. And so when I'm asked, what's your most interesting shipwreck or whatever, it always changes. The answer always changes. And I have a lumber schooner out in front of my house. It's a few hundred yards from my front door, called Maid of the Mist. It ran aground in 18. It was built in 1863. Ran aground in 1878. There was no loss of life, but the schooner's still there, just a little 90-foot boat. And it's one of the coolest wrecks ever. And not just because it's in front of my house, but because I get to spend a lot of time with it. I get to really, really thoroughly look at every nail and every plank and every component of it, and see those little differences and see those little nuances, and wonder why that was done that way or whatever. Where sometimes when you dive an intact ship, especially when in deeper water where you have a limited amount of time on, say it's an intact schooner in 190 feet of water, you get maybe 18 or 20 minutes of time there. So you can see the big picture of it, but you really can't get into the nitty gritty of that wreck on a single dive. And shallow wrecks where you can spend all day on, or snorkeling on, or wrecks that are even on the beaches where you can really thoroughly examine them. It's really cool. You learn, I think, so much more because you can just spend that much more time and tease out these sort of little uh, questions and answers that they provide. So I don't know how to answer the question. There's we found here whalebacks and other kinds of pretty unique uh, ships that are in the lake. But again, I think I'm more attracted to these, just sort of these ones that aren't drawing a lot of attention, that have stories to tell, and they're providing, they're begging you to just say, hey, look at me. And check this out, and you'll be amazed about this stuff. The same is true with artifacts. You have so many artifacts here. Bells and capstan covers and big things like that are the things that people really like to see in museums. But there are inkwells, and there are pencils and pieces of chalk, and whatever, that were held, and they were made by people for specific things and used by people on these boats, and lost by people, and they all similarly have stories to tell. So it's I guess it's an underdog approach. I don't know, of looking at the stuff that nobody else is maybe interested in, because it just seems pretty mundane. Or it's, oh, that's one. As a lumber schooner, there were 3,000 of them operating on the Great Lakes in the 1870s. So who cares about that? I want to go after and look for a one of a kind sort of boat. And again, because these things were handcrafted and they operated individually and were modified throughout their lifetimes, they're different. They're all different to some degree. And yeah, all you got to do is look.
You are so. If I lived where you did and I had a schooner out in front, I'd be out there every day. Like, my goodness, it's not
Yeah.
just a regular schooner. So jealous. That is incredible. I
I
love
won't
that.
lie, it was a selling point for the house. It's like
Oh
the
yeah,
house was like, oh, that's kind of out in the woods. The roads are terrible. It's kind of too small. Oh, there's our shipwreck right in front of the house. Okay,
honey, I
well,
think we
what do
got
you
a
think
winner
about
here. Lucky.
exactly?
How does your wife deal with all this shipwreck fever? Does she go along with it, or she's like, oh, Wayne is Wayne. He's in his own world.
Yeah, she's interested. Pretend she's interested, maybe. I don't know. She's not a diver. She's tried it a few times. It's just not her thing. She spent a lot of her adult life in Florida, so I don't think she's gotten used to the cold water of the Great Lakes yet, even though we've been here, a quarter of a century already. Um, My kids all dive, which is awesome, and my oldest two I've brought on a lot of different projects. My son's a pretty good underwater videographer, and he's made little YouTube videos for uh, the Tuskegee Airplane, for example. When Eric Bryant, the nephew of the pilot, came, my son made this wonderful little video. I think he was only 15 at the time when he made the video, and it's great. It's awesome. It really captures that moment and that time and that passion that's there. Um, and so it's kind of cool to do things with my family, but then it's also, you know, you get that separation, and that's fine too. So,
What is for your son? What is that video in case people are interested in finding that? Is that's on YouTube still, right?
yeah, so it's on YouTube. It's if you Google Nick Lusardi, Lusardi, Tuskegee Airmen, it'll come up, and it's just a little 8 minute clip about his the story that he tells regarding Eric Bryant, the nephew of the pilot's visit to the site, and his emotions and his reactions to his uncle's airplane wreck. And it's a wonderful little video. So Nick Lusardi on YouTube.
Okay. Well, I hope
Yeah.
everybody, hey, everyone, you have give
Check
it a
it out.
check. Give it a check, give it a like, give it a
Yeah.
comment, and I hope that sends him some good traffic. I hope it does. I'm not
Yeah.
anywhere in the millions, but at least with my audience, I love my audience, all of them, and when they're hooked on something, they're gonna give it a try. So I hope y'all give Wayne's son's video a look.
Yeah, awesome. That's awesome. Yeah.
Well, I just got another off the top of my head questions, and then yeah, I just thank you so much for your time that you've been sharing with us and doing all this. Towards the end here, I'll make sure we open up everybody where you can find Wayne, support him, and kind of what you got working on right now, and maybe even stuff coming up later this year. That's something with the spring and summer coming here that I like people to
Yeah.
do. One random question I've been thinking about. I love cowboy western 1880s times type of stuff. Is there a maybe would you know are there any stories of that type of or era type stuff going on in the Great Lakes of the yeah, it's the Wild West, but is there like a wild Michigan time that you can think of anything that happened in that? Because I've been delving huge into 1880s frontier type stuff. I'm like, Michigan's got to have something with that too, right? It can't just all be out in Texas and Arizona and Nevada and whatnot.
Yeah. It's pretty crazy to put things into context, like on a chronological scale, because the vast majority of shipwrecks in the Great Lakes are probably from the early 1870s through the later 1890s. And it's probably a result of the vast majority of ships that ever operated on the Great Lakes operated during that time period. There were about 3,000 schooners in the American fleet alone in the 1870s. And so you got a lot of traffic, you got a lot of accidents that are either results of storms or collisions or whatever. And these were all contemporary with things that were occurring, like Little House on the Prairie and Custer's Last Stand and things like that. But it seems so far removed. And when you start looking at the technology of uh, like hot air balloons going up, carrying horses and pyrotechnics and doing all this kind of crazy stuff out of Chicago and then being lost in the lake in the 1870s. This is only a decade after, not even a decade after the American Civil War. And that idea, that technology that is utilized there it just doesn't seem right from that time period. And the same is true with a lot of these commercial vessels. There's a boat here that sank called Congress that was burning oil as a fuel in the 1860s. And it like really like I thought they were coal burners all the way up until the 1940s or so. And so this was a state of the art kind of vessel. It was something special from the same time period that you're talking about in the American Southwest. That was sort of this Wild West attitude. So there seems just this weird juxtaposition of all this going on. That said, Michigan does have its. Michigan is a thorny place sometimes, and there are things, whether they're true or not. I don't know. I am an archaeologist, and so I try to tell stories based on evidence. and not just good storytelling. And there are subtitles to local journals and newspapers that say never let the facts get in the way of a good story. But I really try to not do that. And sometimes I get it wrong, and that's just how it goes. But so there are stories about pirates on the lakes. There are stories about underground railroad activities on the lakes. There are stories about um, smuggling and bootlegging on the lakes, and a lot of these are can be true. A lot of them are largely fabricated, and it's kind of up to uh, professional historians and archaeologists to kind of suss out what is true, what's real, and what's not real. And some of these stories are so absolutely amazing that you don't have to embellish them. I mean, they're better than any kind of fiction that you can come up with. So yeah, all kinds of stories, and I can't think of any specific to your idea of
Okay.
shootouts and that sort of thing. But there were definitely mysteries that are on the lakes, and there are a lot of authors and researchers that focus on those kind of oddities. And I think Rick is one of those guys that can really draw these stories out, and it's like, oh, I that's crazy, and I didn't even know about that. So I'm sort of a geek and just look at the science and the
I
the fact by fact
You're
things.
a part. You can, because like I want to know what was going on. Okay, you got Jesse James doing this over here at this time period, or you got Billy the Kid, and you got or the what's that, the movie that was Tombstone, like the OK Corral shoe up. And I'm like, while all that stuff's going on, what was going on in Michigan during that time? There's got to be something. It can't just be to this one central area. There's got to be something that's been going on there, and that's I love hearing that.
Yeah. So lots of Michigan was built on a lot of natural resource extraction, with commercial fishing industries, logging and lumbering industries, and paper mills, and that sort of thing. And the ships tie that all together. And so they kind of got people jobs. They got people working. A lot of the shipping companies that own the ships, own the logging camps, own the sawmills, that kind of thing, trying to cut out the middlemen in that. And you had these literal kingdoms almost of these autonomous units that can go into the forest and bring a finished product to the big cities. And so they probably got a little bit of intrigue and weirdness that are associated with them. There are bodies that are found on occasion. There are criminal activities that need to be sorted out. There are mob related kinds of things in later years that are may or may not have happened, but there's some evidence that suggests that they were involved in this airplane or that ship or whatever. They're definitely bootlegging. When you get up into prohibition times in the 20s and 30s, there are definitely vessels that were involved in the illegal liquor trade going back and forth to Canada. The Detroit River and the St. Clair River were just wide open avenues for bringing illegal contraband into the United States, and a lot of airplanes and ships were involved in all that, and some of them went down with it, as did cars and other kinds of things. And we're finding more and more vehicles from the 1920s and 1930s through sonar surveys. These are breaking through the ice, obviously, and going down. I haven't seen one with a trunk load of liquor bottles yet, but I'm sure there's at least one out there. So.
That's a question that comes up. People ask, like, "Oh, you ever find liquor that's still preserved from the 1920s here?" That's people will comment on that sometimes. Or I had one episode where people brought me my questions because I was going to bring Rick on, and I wanted them to be able to ask him through me, and they asked a similar question to that.
Mhm. There is alcohol on some of these ships for sure, and the Regina, it was a Canadian package freighter, went down in 1913 storm, as did a dozen other big vessels that were total losses. This one went down off the thumb of Michigan, and it had about 3,000 bottles of scotch on board. And when divers found it about 40 years ago or so, the state of Michigan issued a permit to commercially recover a lot of that scotch, and so that kind of went into it, got it back into commerce, and even now, I think you can still buy a bottle of scotch every now and again on online, auction sales or that sort of thing. So I've never tasted. I'm not a scotch drinker, so I can't attest to what 110-year-old scotch tastes like from haven't been submerged in the lake for nearly a century. But it does happen, and I've seen liquor kegs on boats, and whiskey kegs, and we have beer from the German vessel Nordmeer that ran aground in 1966 off Alpena. Um, so yeah, so every now and again you do see those kinds of things, and again it's because of the fresh cold water that preserves a lot of this stuff. If it was in a marine environment, you have a metal cap on a bottle, chances are pretty good the salt would have corroded it off, the seawater would have mixed with the original contents and that would be gone. But here, you have the cap that's intact, you have the air bubble that's still in the bottle, and that sort of thing. So it's so much better preservation, generally speaking, in fresh cold water.
I think that's a huge benefit to the Great Lakes is it's
Yeah,
fresh water. It's shark free. It's we're gonna have this stuff for a while. It stinks, like you were saying, because of the zebra mussels and coagula mussels in the lower lakes. Thankfully, everybody I've heard Superior is little to none, and we'll have those wrecks and stuff for a good long while. But it cleared the water up, but it also brings there's a clicking a timer for how long we have this stuff, and
yeah,
um, that's important, I think, too, because this is only these artifacts and wrecks are only going to be here for so much longer.
right. So anything on the earth ultimately wants to become part of the earth again. I mean, that's just the way it works. And entire communities like all of ancient Egypt is being gobbled up by the desert through time, that kind of thing. And shipwrecks are no exception. Eventually, they'll degrade to a point where they're no longer recognizable. But that process is extremely slow in fresh cold water, and so we have the ability to study these sites that can be hundreds of years old. We have rooted tree stumps in the lake floor that are 8,000 years old. So there's a lot of potential for these wrecks to stay around for a very, very long time. When I started diving the Great Lakes in the early 1980s, um, average visibility was maybe 20 or 30 feet on a really good day. And I would trade that back right now in a heartbeat, because then at least you can go up to a wreck and you can see the remnant paint on the outer hull. You can see the caulking between the seams. You can see the name board clearly without having to touch it. You can see all of those kinds of details. Now you can see that wreck from 150 feet away in the springtime when the water is just brilliantly clear. But when you get up to it, all you see is a big shell hash. You see shells that are attached to it. So you don't get to see those details anymore in most cases. And there are a lot of exceptions to that. But it's it's a shame. It's a real shame that we did that, and and we continue to pay for those actions. And so I think it's our responsibility to try to avoid the continued spread of invasive species that have detrimental effects on these cultural resources, especially in the inland lakes and waterways. But they are spreading, they're going everywhere. Fortunately, Lake Superior is relatively devoid of shells, and it's more of a water chemistry thing than anything else. And the lower lakes are all in limestone basins, and you have calcium carbonate that precipitates out of the limestone, and that's the basic chemical for building shells. And so you got that in Lake Superior, where it's sandstones and igneous rock, basalts. You don't have that precipitated lime, calcium carbonate that's in the water column. So you don't have the ability to sustain giant shellfish communities up there, which is good. But it's susceptible to other kinds of problems. The clarity of the water has increased algae blooms in the lower lakes, particularly in Saginaw Bay and Lake Huron and in Lake Erie, for example. And so you're getting one problem after the next that are kind of feeding off of each other. And it's important for us to do what we can to help to abate these and to reverse them, to try to establish a more natural environment again here. And that's way beyond my expertise. I look at cultural resources, but I do look at how these cultural resources are being infected by uh, invasive species and by climate change and other kinds of activities that uh, can, to some degree, be prevented.
Because yeah, I was going to ask, is there anything that can be done, or at least what are some steps maybe you guys are doing to kind of get? I wish we could get rid of them altogether, but like, is there anything really?
There are a lot of ways. Parks Canada did a wonderful study on zebra mussels. Quaggas weren't really even involved at the time of the study. And there are a lot of ways that you can remove them successfully from water intake pipes and from shipwrecks and other things. And that includes putting different kinds of inhibitors on to electrocuting them to just making the environment just unsavory, physically removing that kind of thing. But unless you then isolate that object from the water column, they're just going to recolonize. We can't get rid of them effectively for the long term, and that's the problem. And there are times when their populations wax and wane in different areas for different reasons. But ultimately, they're pretty close to on everything in the lower lakes, and it's really unfortunate. And again, I would trade diving in the 1980s for the visibility that we have today in a heartbeat.
So it was ocean going vessels that brought them in, because I don't think I've ever asked what brought them in. Was it just,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
why?
So they
Why didn't they
came.
think
Yeah,
about that?
yeah. So I don't know. I mean, I can't make that kind of decision, but maybe it was just ignorance. Maybe it wasn't a concern for the widespread of invasive species at the time. I don't know. But ultimately, they were introduced here in the lakes through ship ballast water from vessels that were coming from Europe, where the populations of these Dreissenias originated. And they got into the lakes, and here they are, and now it's been going on a half a century since their introduction here. So it's a long term problem. We're seeing their effects on submerged culture resources more and more. Uh, the physical weight of shell hash on things that is literally crushing sensitive artifacts, collapsing ship decks, that kind of thing. The chemical environment that they establish just through excretion of sort of bodily sorts of things creates a very caustic chemical environment for metals, particularly aluminum. And we're looking at airplanes that are now being not literally eaten alive, but they're really being affected through corrosion because of the chemicals that are excreted from the mussel colonies. When some of the Navy aircraft were first found back in the late 1960s and 70s. Some of them were recovered and put back into flying status. That's how perfectly preserved these aircraft were after a half a century at that time underwater. And now, when you look at these aircraft, their skins, the fuselage looks like Swiss cheese in a lot of cases because of the muscles on them. So the answer, I don't think, is to recover all of them because we don't have the facility to deal with that. There are so many uh, artifacts that are out there. It's to recover a shipwreck is a multi-million-dollar operation just to bring it up out of the water, and then you have to preserve it in perpetuity. So it's a it's a forever commitment that has failed in the past. When we've done things like bring the Alvin Clark out of Green Bay area, uh, and it was beautifully preserved ship that was literally pumped and sailed back to port. It became a museum ship, and then a few years later, it was bulldozed into a landfill because it wasn't properly treated, and ultimately it dry rotted to a point where it just collapsed. So it's a long term commitment, but I think that the onus is on us to document these sites, to document them incredibly thoroughly, because again, whether or not they stay on the lake bottom, ultimately they're going to become part of the earth again. But theoretically, at least the information that we ascertain from them can live on in perpetuity. So that's a big important um, commitment for archaeologists particularly to do, is to collect this data, to make it publicly available, and to archive it so that it can go down generation after generation.
Yeah, that's because a lot of times all you have is a photo, or all you have is a newspaper article, or whatever. So that's important with that.
Yeah.
I would love to have been born in the '80s to see how you are saying all of this now, like, but
Yeah.
incredible. That just maybe people just didn't think about it back then with the mussels and stuff, and but now but like you said, with time, everything is just going to return to the earth. But it's important to get the information, get what you can, um, and preserve it as best as you can. I agree with
Yeah.
that.
And I have, and again, just like the answers to these other questions you asked, I have faith that um, that were these younger generations with their technologies and the knowledge that they have now coming out of the gate is going to help to do this. It's going to help to protect these for future generations better than we could have with our limited knowledge or our limited ability. And I really believe that um, the future of archaeology is strong, and it's going to carry on with the preservation of these historic and cultural and archaeological resources.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Oh, Wayne, I thank you for your time. I've
No,
got one more question, and then I think
sure.
we'll wrap it up and get people where they can connect with you. My final question is one that it's kind of been a question that's brewed throughout the time of this channel and the shipwrecks and stuff. I just recently posted a video on the Mark Hopkins or the Myron that sank up in Whitefish Point, and I learned about the 17 guys that tragically froze in the lifeboat, and then the Captain Neil, how he clung to the roof of the pilot house the entire time being out in that terrible November gale. Um, an aspect with that and all these stories, maybe you can, maybe you can't give me insight into. So people say living in that time frame, they had to have known the risks involved with this type of, hey, I'm going to go out for this amount of time on the lakes on a lumber hooker or on a steel freighter that's bringing these goods back and forth, and with the hey, another wreck just went down. Hey, 12 vessels just went down in 1913. Hey, the armistice. So people had, because that's one thing people love and get passionate about these wrecks is, story after story, this many people die, but they did have to know to a degree the risks involved with this. Is that correct? They knew what they were getting into, and they knew potentially what could happen. Is that correct to say?
I think that there's a certain amount of risk in everybody's lives and everybody's careers to some degree. And so you have to mitigate that risk as best you can, right? When you look at, if you take all 850 known shipwrecks in Michigan and put them on a 1 year calendar, I think like 85% of those wrecks happen between late October and late November. And it's a time when the weather gets sour, and we know that, and everybody knows that. But it's also at a time where you're trying to squeeze that one last trip in for the season, because that one last trip can make or break you, for your overall profits or not. Um, it's at a time when you're trying to move that last load of grain from Illinois or Wisconsin to the eastern seaboard, and you don't have that ability to do that in April or May or June or July. It has to be done after the harvest season, right? It's that last trip of the year to get that iron ore or that copper down from Lake Superior before it really turns bad. So there is risk, and they knew risk was involved, and sometimes it was the greed of a ship owner, the greed of a shipping company. Other times it was just a captain being really, this is just the way it is. We got to do this trip. That's our job. That's what we're here for. These boats weren't just sitting out there doing nothing. They were moving stuff. That's how you make money. You don't make money in an empty boat sitting in a dock. You got to move stuff, and whether that's people or package freight or raw materials, that's the only way uh, to earn a living. And if you can earn that much more before going into winter because you made those last two trips in November, um, people were willing to take that risk. If you look at the 1913 storm, this was it was an amazing storm. I mean, it was described as a white hurricane, where it was this perfect storm of multiple systems that converge over the Great Lakes, created a circular pattern, low pressure systems, near hurricane force winds, snow squalls, the whole works. And there were about 13 total losses in that, but there were about 70 wrecks that occurred during that storm. And a lot of them, most of them, were run aground, or they finally made it into safe harbor in a dilapidated state, but they were impacted. And the ones that ran aground were ultimately recovered and went on to do other things. But there were, about 13 or so that were totally fatal, and they were lost with all hands on all of those. And the average crew size was about 27 or 28 guys on those boats. And so 250 something people, I think, died just on shipwrecks from a 3-day storm over the lakes. When I first started looking into the 1913 storm, I thought, wow, man, all of these boats got caught out there. And that's actually not the case. The reality is that a lot of those boats went out into the storm.
Mm.
And so they were already in safe harbor. And they decided they're gonna attempt it. Or it seems to be the weather seems to be improving, and we gotta move. And so they left safe harbor at places like Marquette, at places like the straits up at Sault Ste. Marie, and then went out into the storm and ultimately paid the ultimate price for that. So what caused them to do that? It's got to be an individual basis, I suppose, but it all comes down to making that last trip, making that money. I don't want to just call it greed. I want to call it, that's your livelihood. That's what your job is. And so I do believe that most of the folks, especially the uh, the shipping companies and the officers, they knew the risk that they were taking, and they tried to mitigate that as best they could, but they still went out and ultimately either made bad decisions, or were just overwhelmed with wind and weather.
Yeah, it's a multiple factor thing. Like you were touching, not to throw captains under the bus, but there's some captains that were heavy. They were known for heavy seas captain. They're gonna do it regardless, and it would maybe it was a reputation thing. Like they're always known for this, but then with the Great Lakes, these storms can whip up so quickly. It may look nice and calm one minute, or hey, I think we can get it through. 20, 30 minutes later, it changes so drastically, or even with fog, the amount of collisions that were happening that were crystal clear. It may have been one moment, but then this pea soup fog forms and these collisions happen. Or like the whalebacks, a lot of whalebacks they were so low into the water, they got rammed, like the Thomas Wilson, or the I believe the James B. Colgate was another, or the Clifton wasn't rammed, but at least the Clifton. Man, can you imagine being on the Clifton out in Lake Huron in that storm and oy oy oy.
Yeah, it's before I came up to the Great Lakes, I worked on the USS Monitor project out of North Carolina and Virginia, and you got a ship that is not built for the open sea. The freeboard on Monitor was like 18 inches or something like that. And so you put it in anything bigger than that, and your deck's awash. And it must have been terrifying, to be on anything but flat, calm sea state for some of these vessels, including a heavily loaded whaleback, and then build up ice on top of it and whatever. But these guys, they made a living doing this, and I think they understood the risks. They pushed the envelope for sure. It's just like pilots, especially the early test pilots. There were a lot of
Yeah.
test aircraft that went down over the lakes. Uh, Somebody had to fly them, and they knew the risk. They knew that there's a good chance that they can die in accidents with these aircraft that had never been flown before, and yet they were willing and able to take those risks. And it's the same is true today. And fortunately, I think we have the technology and the appreciation now to mitigate these risks a lot better through much more extensive testing and regulations and that sort of thing. But there's always going to be a factor with that when you're working against nature, especially in something like the inland seas here.
What was the aircraft that was lost out in Lake Michigan? That pretty major one, loss of life that I don't think they found yet. What was that?
Yeah, it was a Northwest Flight 2501.
I think that's, yeah.
Yeah, this is for Valerie Van Heest over in Holland, Michigan, had been looking for it for a bunch of years. It had 58 people on board. There were 55 passengers and three crewmen, or a pilot, a co-pilot, and a flight attendant. that went down on the airplane. The Right after the incident happened, a lot of wreckage was found, floating debris was recovered for weeks on end. After that, it was all over lower Lake Michigan and was coming ashore on the beaches from South Haven and Holland and that whole stretch of coastline. But the primary wreckage has never been found. And I suspect that it rained down over a very large area. And that area of Lake Michigan has sand movement that occurs. There's soft sediments,
One more time,
so it's
sorry. The audio cut
yeah,
out. Was the area that you?
yeah. So it's got a lot of sediments, got a lot of fine sediments down there. So it's not like a bedrock bottom.
What was the name of the
It's
area though? You said you believe it was.
just lower Lake
Okay,
Michigan.
okay,
You know,
okay.
off of South Haven, Grand Haven, Holland. That kind of stretch there, and it's a it's easy to gobble things up. There are shipwrecks that are even in deep water that very often get completely covered in sand, and they might be hardly visible at all. And then something happens, a storm event or something, and you go down to this wreck site that's at 110 feet of water, and all the sand is blown away, and you can get down into the lower hull and that sort of thing. So you expect that in the near shore. These shallow water wrecks sometimes can be buried for decades, and all of a sudden they pop up after a storm. But you don't really expect that in deeper water. But the Great Lakes are extremely dynamic, especially Lake Michigan, which is mostly a sand sort of based lake. The sediment transports, it moves around, and it covers and uncovers at will. And a lot of times we have a very small window to be able to study these wreck sites, because you don't know if it's going to be covered up again tomorrow. You don't know if it's going to get pushed down the beach, for miles after the next storm. So we have to react to them when they're exposed as best we can, and that's where volunteers come in. I have a bunch of volunteer divers around the state. I have a bunch of volunteer beachcombers around the state that literally help me fill out forms. They find wreckage on the beach. They see a plank that they don't know if it's for shipwreck or a piece of a dock or something else, but they can photograph it, get GPS coordinates on it. There are forms that you can download from the Michigan DNR website, from the Michigan State Historic Preservation website, that are called beach wreckage forms. And you can fill out this information and act as citizen scientists to help me, because I'm a one person and there's a lot of coastline in Michigan, and there's a lot of area in Michigan that is available for study. And so I rely on uh, partnering institutions, government agencies, law enforcement, academia, and the private sector. And I rely on volunteers all the time to help me collect information about these wrecks, not to collect the wrecks themselves, but to take photographs, to take measurements, to take good location information, that sort of thing. And then we can make decisions on what best course of action it is to do with that. And this could include little things like nails and pieces of coal. It can include big sections of wreckage. And there are many places in Michigan where nearly entire shipwrecks are up on the beaches or buried within the beaches, that non-divers, non-snorkelers can go and kind of experience this, 120-year-old maritime heritage firsthand, just by walking down the beach at Ludington State Park or at 40 Mile Point or wherever. That there's a big chunk of wreckage there that has a story to tell.
Incredible, incredible. Yeah, I've growing up in Michigan my whole life, I've heard of that where the dunes would kind of part back and oh, it revealed a such and such schooner barge. I remember hearing that all the time that they would come and then they'd be gone after that.
Yeah, it's pretty wild. It's a living being. These lakes are really very extremely dynamic, and they decide, I think, when they want to reveal their secrets more than we decide.
Absolutely. No, you can't agree with you more on that. Wayne, I thank you so much for your time. I could talk to you for the next 3 days and not get bored in any way. I appreciate your willingness, your openness to share this with all of us and ultimately keep this torch burning bright. I want to ask you, where can people support you, help you? Maybe what's some things you got coming up here in the future that you want to share or get people excited about? And yeah, just where can people help you or what's stuff like that?
Yeah. Yeah, I think again, especially this time of year when winter is, I think, starting to end. Though there were snow flurries in the air, this morning. But people, more and more folks are getting out. The beaches generally change quite a bit through the winter because of ice movement and rising or lowering water levels. And so you never know what you're going to find on the beach. And I think that the best thing that you can do is if you find anything that looks peculiar, interesting, or historic, is to get in touch with me directly through my email or get in touch with the Department of Natural Resources. If you Google, DNR beach wreckage, a form will come up, and so you can kind of see my contact information through that, and you can help, you can assist in the documentation and preservation and understanding of these historic resources that we can all share. And don't collect things, leave them in place. That's important, but do collect the information from them, and that would be incredibly helpful for me. And then, if it's something that is requires removal because for the protection of either people from stepping on a board full of nails, or it's something that's important and needs to be put into a museum and conserved somewhere, we can kind of go from there. But the first step is finding things, reporting things, and knowing about it, and then making those decisions. So that would be the best case. I also have a volunteer dive program that I work heavily with the Michigan Underwater Preserve Committee, which has a bunch of underwater preserves around the state. And they have divers that are affiliated with all of those that help to put in mooring buoys on shipwrecks on a seasonal basis. So usually it's about starting now, in late April, early May, where buoys go in on these wrecks. And that prevents having to put anchors down onto the wrecks and do damage that way. So these are permanent sort of seasonal moorings that you can just go up, tie your boat to. And then at the end of the season, which is in usually October ish, those buoys have to come back out of the lake so that they don't get crushed or moved around by the ice. And this is all done by volunteers. And there are many dozens of volunteer divers that are affiliated with these underwater preserves throughout Michigan. Get involved with them. I guarantee if you live nearby the coast, you will be close to one of these underwater preserves. You can see a map of them. Just Google, Michigan underwater preserves. You'll see a map exactly where they all are, and get involved with them. If you can't find contact information, get in touch with me, and I'll be happy to provide you with the closest underwater preserve personnel in your area. Um, the other thing is we have a Michigan Archeological Society that is all across Michigan. It's a bunch of different chapters, and it's where avocationalists and professionals get together and do archaeological projects. And a lot of them are done on land, some of them are done in the water, a lot of them are done in that intermediate area on the beaches and in swamps and other kinds of things. And they often provide a great opportunity to do field work, especially if you have a specific interest in an area. You're going to find like-minded folks that have those same kind of interests and knowledge, and you'll be surprised on how many of you all out there that they're really excited about, old barns in the Leelanau or something like that, or shipwrecks on the beaches in Lake Huron. So yeah, get involved with area museums, with area historical societies, and that sort of thing, and bring your expertise. Whether you're a photographer, a writer, or whatever, they're always seeking those opportunities and those kinds of specialized sort of expertise that people can provide, and then just the labor of it. And it's ultimately it helps all of us, and it helps us all tell the stories, and it helps to preserve these artifacts and these sites for future generations.
Outstanding. Outstanding, Wayne. That is brilliant. Wayne, thank you again. Everybody, you heard it. That's what we need. Um, thank you, Wayne, incredibly for your time.
Oh
Thank
man,
you for your
really,
your openness. I uh I very much want to take you up on that offer and make a video for everybody possibly going to a snorkel wreck or the Tuskegee, whatever, if we can tag along for that and see the whole process with that, or just see a day in your eyes through something like that. I'm your
yeah, let's
man.
do it. All right, we got to wait a couple of months. let the water get warm. So,
Oh gosh, my passion and fire is going to melt the ice and snow right from here and now.
awesome.
Thank you,
That's
Wayne.
awesome. Yeah, I appreciate your time, and I'd love to talk to you again. Do some follow up
Absolutely.
in the road. So awesome.
I will have you back as often as I can get you. So.
Sounds great.